Did you catch that, Marty? Probably not. You didn't catch that, did you?
I didn't catch that. Can you give me a brief synopsis? I understand it's one of your, well, it is like
Christmas tradition.
your Christmas tradition.
Yes, it is. Because like I thought, like having a tree and then having like succumbing to getting a fake tree, and I'm thinking like I don't even want to do the fake tree. What I'd rather have, and is just like a Yule log or something like that. I don't know, just something simple. But like then I went to Barcelona in 2000. I went to Barcelona in 2011, and I was walking around the downtown area, and I saw these kids like up on stage,
Sure.
and they had this log that looks exactly like this. I made my own. It's a log, got some legs, right? This is Cacatillo, and Cacatillo. What you do is like all the children take a stick and they hit it, and it poops out candy. Or if you've been bad, it poops out like a sardine or something like that. I don't know, but it's really
Well, that's all I'd get.
all right. So this year, I think I'm going to put some presents under it. I'm just going to go full Cacatillo on in this household. So anyway, this is mine. I made it, and then I'm not going to throw it into the fire though, because I've used this one for like 10 years now. So anyway,
No,
other than that, how are you?
Oh, doing great. It's been this week was a let's powder coat everything week. That's so far, at least since last we met. A lot of powder coating going on.
I saw some of those fancy pictures. Those are nice. Like I see some darker purple stuff going on.
Yeah, it's kind of a new technique that, not new, but new to me. One of the customers had requested a specific color, which brought on a specific process. So it was cool. It's multi-layers, and you really don't see the finish color until the very last clear coat that you put on it, and it brings out all the color. Prior to that, it starts out kind of the color, and then it goes to silver, and yeah, I don't know. It's
we haven't even like introduced ourselves. I'm John Ferguson. This is Coffee Tech Talk Tuesday. That's
hello,
Marty
John.
Rowe. He's also here, and we're here every Tuesday. And we'd like you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. But on top of that, every one of those subscriptions up until the end of the year, or maybe even a little bit more, I got my stimulus check coming. I know where it's going. It's going to this GoFundMe. We're looking for 1,500 new subscribers, and for each one, we're going to give $1 to GoFundMe. So we're going to be raising 1,500 tips to baristas, and that's with help from Barista Magazine. Sarah Allen helped out there. Marcus Marcus Bonney. Oh my gosh, I learned that one. Oh my gosh. And then you and I, we're going to pitch in.
Well, yeah, but they do more than just tips to the baristas. Again, and I keep saying this, they blew my mind with all the stuff that they do. So it's really go check them out. They're online, easy to find.
There's like Talkspace. They do grants for for different folks and really helping out in a tough year. So yeah, go check it out. And next week, what we should do? We should just like actually get out our phones and donate the money on the 29th, which is like the end of the year. Yeah. And we'll do it together after I get the stimulus check. We'll just give it.
Absolutely. We'll make it happen.
So let's go GoFundMe. And then today we got Kaley Gann, or Kaley Gann. I don't know. That was a purposeful mess up on that name. It's like a terrible host. I'm like, I thought I was getting better and better at this, but no, Kaley is here. She's with us, hanging out in the waiting room. There she is.
Yeah.
Hey, Marty, do you know where she used to live?
Well,
yeah.
In part of her life, she lived in Kansas City.
Oh,
I understand she started out a little bit east of Kansas City in the coffee world, and she'll go into that. But no, we were hugely blessed, especially during the time that she was competing and doing a right fine job. We were blessed to have her as part of the coffee scene right here in Kansas City.
And now maybe, was that the last competition too?
It was the last one.
So like she got an extra full year of like this champion.
Yeah, an extra year of wearing the crown.
That is so awesome. It's like you got 2 years. Let's so we're no, that's great. That's great. Now it's a terrible.
Gotta look for a silver lining.
Yeah, we got to talk more about that. Like what happened this year and like what kind of like all that stuff. So anyway, I would like to talk about brewing coffee today, but also I just want to mention the Pantone 2021. These are the colors, gray and yellow. I don't know how I feel about that, but
well, isn't gray a non-color? Isn't that?
What do you think about that, gray and yellow for 2021? I mean, keep it bland, keep it just nothing too exciting. Just kind of.
I would make it for 2020.
Well, 2020 was probably just like I don't know, just not a different, like maybe just black and really, I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking more of green, new growth for 2021, moving forward, fresh.
Well,
but I'm not on that committee.
Talk about blooming and fresh. Did you say blooming?
I did.
And you said fresh, right?
I did.
We should talk about brewing coffee because those are two things that are important. You like that forced segue?
That was great.
We got this other video. We got another video that's not like Cagatillo. This one's a little bit more serious.
Okay. Am I going to be able to see this one?
Yeah.
How do drip coffee machines work? When you fill up the reservoir with fresh, cold water, it immediately flows down and levels out within the appliance. The tubing runs past the heating element, which is responsible for both heating the plate the pot sits on and heating the water. When the coffee machine is turned on, it runs an electric current through the heating element. A sensor keeps the temperature of the element in check, switching it off and on to maintain an even temperature. The water in the heated tubing starts boiling, which forms air bubbles that rise up through the tubing. A one-way valve ensures they go in the correct direction. These bubbles are big enough and the tubing narrow enough that they force drops of water upward and out of the shower head, where the water is distributed over the coffee grounds. The water runs through the ground beans and picks up the coffee oil as it finds its way through to the bottom of the paper filter, out the basket, and into the pot, making you the proud owner of freshly brewed Joe.
John, that makes me want to go have a cup of coffee.
I was taking notes. I was like, 1908, first filter. It was made out of paper. Question.
Awesome. You threw some history in there, little animation. That's really cool. There's, this is really a pretty simple brewing device, and we try to teach people how to work on equipment, and I share with them that we're just making hot water and pouring it over grounds. I don't care how complicated the machine gets. That's really all we're doing. But there's some uniqueness. Did you want to chat about this particular design a little bit?
Well, yeah, because like I've taken one of these apart. I went to the thrift store and I bought one for like $5 just because I was kind of curious. Just like take all the plastic shelf, the plastic off of it, and just kind of look at the insides and be like, what is a coffee brewer actually doing? And it seemed like there was power. There was some sort of heating element. There was a water reservoir, some tubing that goes through, and it seemed like the heating element, like the water might have passed through there, and then it got hot, and then like you mentioned, there was like this one-way valve, I guess, that kept the water that was boiling back up into the reservoir, and it forced it up the tube, and it was just basically dripping over the coffee.
Sure.
So is that all what's going on there? I mean, like with the heating element down there, what does that exactly do, and how does it know that it's going to stop at 205 degrees or whatever?
Well, here's the deal. Here's kind of my take on it. This is your quintessential Mr. Coffee type brewing device. And I say that, and I know a lot of people in the coffee industry go, oh, Mr. Coffee, that's not a very good. This is the exact same design that the SCA certified brewers use. They've just done a better job of the magic between the heating element and where it comes out over the coffee. They've done a better job of designing so that temperature is more constant than your average Mr. Coffee. But the process is the same. So you've got a reservoir that's, the coffee or the water is heavy. It wants to drop down. That little ball below it, that is a check valve that only lets things go one way. And then it goes down.
Right?
Goes
down, right?
Correct.
Right.
And so then it goes to that heat element that's underneath your vessel there. And that actually heats it up to a boiling point. And it does boil. And
Right.
that action of boiling and expanding forces that hot water that is boiling to go somewhere. Well, since it can't go back up in the reservoir because of that magic check valve, the only path that it's got is up and over a spray head that dispenses it over the grounds. And that if you listen to it, it's going to be a little bit cyclic. In other words, it'll boil and then a little bit of fresh water will come in and it'll cool off and then it'll boil. And it continues that process until all of the water has forced its way into that heating element that builds it up to boiling point, burps it up over the coffee grounds, and pretty soon you've got coffee.
And you know what I wanted to do with this one? I was like, okay, how do I get the heating element outside from underneath the carafe, because I don't want to burn my coffee. I don't want a hot plate, right? So I'm just thinking, like, if I just didn't have the heating element underneath the hot plate, there are brewers like that, like Techniform.
Sure.
I think.
Techniform, Bonavita.
And the Techniform has the same thing. It's a reservoir, tubing down, goes a heating element, pushes the
identical
up, and then it pours it over this, like little stem thing, and then it just kind of drips. But
Sure.
it's all gravity fed, and there's nothing really special about it, except for maybe the differences between these machines are maybe the tube diameter or the radius, the tubing, and then also the amount of water that is pressure, that it's flowing, and then also you said the screen, the shower head, right?
Shower head.
How many holes, how big it is, how much it spreads around. So there's a lot of room for inventiveness, right? And also like
exactly
variation, and that's really where it comes. But the basics are, these are all just push a button, make the water boil, and pour it over coffee, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the active boiling that pushes it over.
Right. So if I have a hot water kettle at home that costs me like $30 from Target, it doesn't look fancy, but it's metal and it boils water, and I pour that over something that's like what you'd call manual pour over brew, it's kind of neat because it gives you a little bit more room to experiment, but also a lot more room to make mistakes. And so I think that's a battle that we have. It's like we have a lot of creativity that we can take, but we also have that challenge of replication of sort of like, wow, that was a really good pour. That was a good delivery of hot water over that bed, but can you do it exactly the same all the time? And what kind of things out there can you do to kind of help you replicate that? Like,
sure.
Again.
You bring up a good point, because all of these designs and all of these brewing devices, they're all doing the exact same thing. They're creating hot water, and in some form or manner, whether it's gravity or whether it's boiling and pushing it, some way they're getting that hot water to drip down over top. So where the magic is, and where the creativity and the art and the ability to extract a better cup of coffee, if you will, that comes from the design of the droplets coming from the spray head. So the design of the spray head, the design of the tubing, so that it
basket
temperatures
the type of filter medium.
Exactly. The amount of time it takes to do that.
We're going to go over that later.
So
I got
wouldn't it be cool that you could just do that yourself?
Yeah. I've got this for you. What is this? Again, Pantone 2021. What is
this? Oh, well, that's a chart that's used. I got that. No, that's a chart that's used in the coffee industry.
Do you know where it came from?
It says right there, the Coffee Brewing Handbook.
That's right. I just want to reference it. I think it, like Ted Lingle kind of was the one who at least drafted this.
Sure.
And I just wanted to call out that.
Now, I do know that with the SCA-A combining with the SCA-E, that there's been some modification or some thought process. At the bare minimum, there's been some really cool discussions around this whole chart and what truly is the ideal optimum balance for your coffee. But this helps quantify.
I think to a lot of people who've never seen this before, it's like quite a mess. So not to get into it, we're not going to have like a half-hour class about it, but right smack in the middle, it says ideal optimum balance. But what's on the bottom? What does soluble yield extraction % mean?
That means how much material did you actually soak out of the coffee itself that ended up in the cup?
And how much is readily available to be taken out of a coffee bean? Because like if the whole coffee bean was soluble, there'd be nothing left after it was brewed. But we have like all these ground coffees that we have to throw away. So there's a certain amount that's left over, right?
Exactly. There's part of the, there's a lot of material that's left over. Right. And not all of that material is water soluble. And not all of that material is soluble at the same temperature.
Right. So according to this chart, we're looking at, it says 18 to 22% of the bean itself, the weight, the whole thing. Like about 20% of that is how much you want to take, but you don't want the rest, right? Or something.
Well, exactly.
What's the feeling about that?
Because some of it won't come, and some of it, if it does, won't taste good.
Right. Might be more bitter or astringent or something like that. That's why it says strong bitter, and then weak bitter and bitter bitter, all of this 26. But over here, 13 to 18, it says underdeveloped.
Are you rapping now? Bitter bitter.
Bitter bitter. You like that?
Bitter, yeah.
And then on the left side, it says strength, soluble concentration percent. What does that refer to? Is that total dissolved?
Well,
in a sense, or
in a sense, it's
Does Kaley know this?
Okay, I bet.
Maybe.
I bet Kaley can walk us, grab us by the hand,
Kaley,
and walk
do you
us
know anything
through
about this? You
both
want to
of
join
these.
in?
He's going.
Hi, yeah, I can.
Kaley?
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to the show. What's going on
Thanks
with
for having
this?
me.
Well, before you get started, Kaley, you had to to compete at the level that you competed, you had to really, truly embed yourself into this whole concept, didn't you?
Yeah, definitely.
What is this concept? And you know, we have a lot of intro to do, but we're just going to throw you right in, and then we're going to introduce you later. But nice guitars and stuff too.
Yeah, help us out here.
Yeah, for sure. So you're correct. Obviously, the bottom is the percentage of like the bean itself that you can extract, and to the right, or sorry, to the left, the solubles concentration is like the TDS. So that is what you actually completely dissolve. That's percentage that you're able to completely dissolve, which will obviously be smaller than the extraction yield. So
Kaley, is that because it's a ratio between what solids you did pull out of the bean mixed with what water you've got?
yeah.
And so it's how thick, if layman's terms, that water is with those solubles. Is that right? Is that
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Is there an app for this?
Yes, there's an app, and
You
typically you can measure this with the refractometer. There's also a pretty long equation that you can use, but there is an app for that. Like there's an app for everything. So yeah.
So would you agree? Would you agree, not to interrupt you, but well, I'm going to steer you in something to help me think of it. Would you agree that this chart and things like this and just the thought process of it would help you understand what actually makes a good cup of coffee?
It is a quantitative tool, which is very nice. It is not the it's not the authority of it all, as we're starting to realize. I've had really good cups of coffee that have, by this chart, could fall into one of the outside squares, but that still tasted really well balanced. But overall, it's a really good learning tool. Like I said, it's quantitative, which is really nice, but sometimes you do go outside of the range, and you can still have really good tasting coffee.
One last thing about this chart, the red lines that say 40 grams, 45 grams, 50 grams, it says grams per 1 liter. Is that right? That's the brewing ratio. Is that how you use that? So like if it says, for example, the 18, and it says 50 grams, how do you utilize that?
Yeah, so
measurement?
Yeah, so for 1 liter, if you're using 50 grams, I'm guessing this is for like a drip machine.
Right.
Assuming because it's a liter, that's kind of where it would fall. So
if there was like 18% of a soluble yield and you're using 50 grams, okay.
Then that's how it's going to taste.
So this, like you said, I think this is a great tool for quantifying things, but maybe not necessarily I don't know. I mean, I think you're on the, I think I was really thinking about having you on the show because you broke kind of the rules. And that's the whole idea of like, this is how coffee is brewed, right? You have to do this, that, and the other. And then you start thinking about, well, coffee can be brewed in so many different ways if you look at it differently, right? Like, um, but I have a hand up from Dietrich, who is running the show. What do you got?
Yeah, well, the only time I've seen, well, not the only time, but the time I have seen this chart as well was someone was dialing, when you dial in your drip coffee machine, it's a good tool to just kind of start at. If you can hit those parameters, then you can build off from there, similar to like dialing in with espresso. Would you agree with that, Kaley, or?
Yeah, definitely. Truthfully, it comes down to taste at the end of the day, because you can have something that, like I said, is smack dab in the middle on this chart, but it will taste completely out of balance. And it's largely due to coffee changing so much. And over the years, we've seen even like the standards for espresso change quite a bit, the time and the amounts. And there seems to be like a general right answer, but there really isn't any right answer. So yeah, it's a good reference tool, and it's good to introduce to someone who is dialing in a drip machine or espresso, or who's just learning about coffee. But as a coffee professional, we rarely pull this up unless we're training.
Well, hey, let's talk
So
about the rules. I want to talk about the rules. I want to like bring this next slide up. These are the brewing standards by the Specialty Coffee Association. Actually, it's the Golden Cup standard, and this is the definition. Coffee shall exhibit a brew strength. Oops, there we go. A brew strength measured in total dissolved solids of 11.5 to 13 grams per liter, corresponding to 1.15 to 1.35% on the SCA brewing control chart, resulting from solubles extracted from 18 to 22%. That's a nice aim, right? For a general, like when I'm teaching maybe someone on like, how do you pull in a shot of espresso? Where do you start? I usually say like, well, you need this much coffee in the basket, if that's the basket, and you want this much time, and then you want this much beverage weight. And then you can kind of experiment from there and kind of dial in with the coffee. Is that kind of how you would also use this Golden Cup standard, Marty or Kaley? What do you think?
Well, I'll answer first, and then we'll let. Anyway, I was trying to think of something very smart aleck to say, and I couldn't do it.
You almost got there.
We we set up a lot of machines for a lot of different companies, and we kind of use this as let's get started, kind of like what Dietrich was saying. Was we know that if we hit this target, it's not going to be bad by any means. It may not be as good as that coffee can be, but it's not going to be bad at all. And so we generally start there, and quite frankly, in a restaurant or a situation like that where we're setting up equipment, if we hit these targets, we're done, because it's not a bad target. Kaley?
yeah, I agree. I think it's a really good starting point, and making minor tweaks from there. Again, especially if you're going with something as consistent and reliable, I guess, as a drip machine, like it's going to taste like pretty similar day to day. So this is a really good starting point, because you can't, unless you have a really, really nice brewer, but even then, you're not going to get a whole lot of complexity out of a drip brewer, only because there isn't the element of pours, which we can get into later. You have typically more control if you're doing a manual pour over, but this is a really good starting point when you are dealing with, well, any type of brewing, but especially something like a drip coffee machine.
So this is pretty cool. We have a target in mind, and we know how to get there. We can have classes about this. You can Google this. You can understand like, how to use a TDS and how to get an extraction percentage. And there's a thing called Coffee Tools. It's a nice app, and it talks about the beverage weight and how much water might have been left in the basket with the grounds that you have to discount. So there's really cool equations that you can but getting to this is the fun part, right? Like there's so many different ways you can brew coffee to get to this Golden Cup standard that I think is kind of fun. It's kind of outside the box, like cold brew. Can cold brew get to this Golden Cup standard through using methods that are kind of not necessarily traditional when it comes to time and temperature, or maybe even like turbulence, right? And I don't know if you'd agree with that. I don't know. I've never tried it. Actually, I'm trying it right now. I just I'll get to that later. But like yeah, I just think like is that something that you can reach, but like kind of, you know, going from a fully different direction. And I think that what you did at here in this photo, is this right? You're doing
Yeah.
something kind of outside the box, because there's this thing has a bunch of, I mean, obviously you probably did you use a filter? Or because that would have
Yeah.
been a pretty coarsely ground coffee if you didn't.
Yeah,
So
it'd be a
what's
lot of
going on
sediment.
here, and why what are you doing here? And what's the difference between your standard pour over and what you've created here?
All right. So here in this picture, I am competing in the national championship in Kansas City. And that device is my custom brewer I used for that competition. Uh, I had this strange idea where I almost wanted an anti brewer, which sounds weird, but I wanted to almost take the brewer out of the equation entirely and rely heavily on my own pours and how I interact with the coffee. I also wanted it to be very fast. So basically, I wanted to have a filter and coffee elevated in thin air and nothing else. And I wanted to brew out of it, but clearly that's impossible. So I didn't want any brewer to have any influence on my coffee. I wanted to do my own thing with the coffee. I don't want any restrictive angles. I wanted it to be filtered, want hot water. So I tried making something that had a like very little influence on the brew. So this brewer is only there for heat insulation and filter support. It doesn't really do anything other than that, which is nice. So it is extremely fast, which is awesome. The faster the brewer, like the easier the flow rate, the finer I can grind. And when you grind finer, you get a more narrow particle distribution, which means more even particles. And when you have more closely sized particles, you usually can get more of a balanced cup, a little bit more flavor clarity while still maintaining complexity. So that was my idea behind that brewer.
I also noticed that it's somewhat of a flat bottom, which gives you a lot of extraction surface, right? Rather than a cone, where perhaps maybe a cone would cause a little bit more restriction or compaction or flow rate issues. Because with really finely ground coffee, or even whatever that means, you're going to find maybe like some flow rate issues. And so I thought this was really clever. I haven't really gotten to taste any coffee out of this yet. So, but is there more than, how many of these do you have? Are they like in production yet? I'm sure you get that question a lot, so I thought I'd ask it.
I get that question all the time still
Right.
for almost 2 years now.
So heads up,
Um,
here's your refresher. We're gonna
yeah.
put this out there.
It was in production with a local company in Kansas City, but that kind of fell through due to it just being a small company and not able to manufacture these. Like ceramic is honestly pretty pricey, so it didn't ultimately work out. And then the pandemic hit, which halted any additional conversations I had with some other companies about producing it. So as far as what is in existence, I think maybe 4 of them are in existence, maybe
Oh
5.
wow. Wow,
Yes.
that just put the price up really high.
Yeah. I have a couple of them. One that has circular holes instead of square holes. That's also very nice. And then I think one's in China with the Chinese champion, the world champion.
And what
Haley, you know, you talk about a fast brewer, and you know, part of our job here at our place is to introduce different pour over methods to the general public, and we talk about the different flow rates, and about the fastest one that we would sell would be a V60, because it flows pretty fast. And I call it the sports car of all the brewers devices. And so by comparison, I think yours is like a hand-built Ferrari that puts you in total control.
and
That You know,
Yeah.
it totally depends on how you pour it and how you grind
Yes.
it.
Yeah, and to put it into perspective, it is so fast that I grind it just a touch finer than you would an AeroPress to make an espresso. So on a 1 to 16 scale on say an EK43, I grind on like a 5 or 6. Whereas V60 sometimes it's like 9 to 10.
Would you say
Mhm.
So
that that's like finer than table salt? Like, or about a little bit,
yeah,
than
it
table
depends on
salt?
how consistent your grinder is. But yeah, it's finer than table salt.
But so a little bit
It's like
more than like an espresso shot for sure, but
Yeah,
not.
it's kind of in between espresso and AeroPress, more approaching AeroPress. So it's a little like granular, but it's detectably powdery as well. So it's
So,
pretty fine.
so with this brewer, then there has to be a filter medium, maybe. And what did you use for that?
I use the Kalita filter because it is flat bottom and it molds to the brewer really well. So it kept that flat bottom. And I used the pack that has the blue lettering on it. They're a little bit thinner than the black packs. So they're super, super thin, which again helps with the flow rate.
Thread count matters, right? I mean, like
Yes.
I did a Brewers Cup a while ago, and I was like looking at all the different types of like cone filters, and looking like through the light and realizing there's a difference. It really depends on what you want, but whatever works for whatever brew you have. But filters matter. I just love it. Everything matters, especially when you're doing competition. And I wanted to. That's a question for later. I can't wait to get to that one. I have a video that I grabbed off of the internet, and probably it's on YouTube. So whatever, we're gonna show it. Dietrich, do you want to throw that? This is the comparison of 3 different brewers, and Marty, I think you're gonna like this one too. And Kaley, I know you've seen this one.
Did that Chemex even ever get done?
Yeah, 7 minutes and 25. And that's so funny because like I was playing around with like putting a Chemex underneath an automated brewer, and playing with the flow rate and all that stuff, because there was always this compaction on the top of the Chemex, and I was always like the restrictive aspect of the Chemex always kind of bothered me, and I like that faster flow rate capacity. So this is what Espro Bloom, and I think that you had something to do with this too, right? What's going on here? This looks like a espresso basket on the bottom of a pour over.
Yeah, so it's a bunch of really, really tiny holes, clearly, but they're angled in a way that when the stream comes down, it swirls together and it holds like, yeah, it vortexes and um it holds heat really well, but it's also extremely fast, similar to my brewer. So yeah,
And
it's a swirling effect.
so how did you get involved with this brewer?
That's a fun story. So right after I competed in Worlds in Boston, after a few weeks after nationals in Kansas City, literally after I did my round with my brewer, I had 2 men come up to me in suits with business cards, and they're like, "Hey, we're with this company out of Vancouver, Espro. We want to build your brewer. Call us." And I was like, "Okay." I just competed, so I was like, "All right, yeah, I'll give them a call." Um, so what ended up happening was I was going to do it with Convivial out of Kansas City, so I declined their offer to produce my actual brewer. Um, and then later on, they wanted to make a brewer that had elements of the brewer I designed, but without obviously being the same brewer. But they were like, "This is largely inspired by what you did. Like, we want you to collaborate with us on it." So they sent me a few prototypes, and we worked together on getting basically the correct filter, that one that fits it very well, has a very like specific filter,
Right.
thinner filters, the silicone grip on top, and then getting the flow rate.
And you can find this on Amazon, I think, right? I think I found them for like $30 or somewhere around that range. You know,
Yeah.
25 if you're lucky, 40 if you're not. You know, but it's, so I
Yeah.
haven't used this yet. But I was gonna get one, but it was just 2 days ago that I thought about it. So I'm like, well, I can't get it today, so I can't really talk about it. But I can't wait to play around with it. Marty, have you had a chance to play around?
I have not. I've been
Well,
fixing machines.
I
So
wish we had
no.
this. I wish we had this show 2 weeks ago, so everybody would have gotten one for Christmas. But now everybody's got to spend their stimulus money on this thing.
All right, everybody go out, get one or two,
Yeah,
and then we'll get Kaley back on and we'll do another show.
we talk about it, and then you can do this at home by yourself. You can do like your Espero Bloom, and you can do your V60 and Chemex, and put them all on a scale and fail at a brewer's cup, because I don't think you can do that. Can you? 3 different brew methods. Anyway. No.
It's a V60.
Looks like that, yeah.
Well, so I have a couple questions about just brewing, and I've been kind of playing around with this idea of just like throwing some whole bean coffees in a mason jar and then filling it with water and then seeing what happens, right? So like, you know, my question to y'all is like, it's going to be at a certain point of saturation, right? Where it's going to grab enough stuff out of the coffee where it will become completely saturated, and then it will like disperse into the surrounding water, and it will have been brewed, right? And with cold brew, for example, you grind it really coarse, but this is like super coarse, right? So coarse that it's not even ground. Is that something? Do you actually have to grind coffee in order to make it extractable?
I don't know, John. Let us know when you how long has this jar been
5 hours.
soaking? 5 hours.
About 5
Okay.
hours.
Well,
But I had done this in the past, right? And I let it sit in the refrigerator for a couple of days, and it resulted in a brewed coffee.
I could see where it would do something. We had not to rob this time that we've got here, but this last week, I got into several online discussions about different variables that you would have in brew methods. And we talked about applying a label of energy to each one of those variables, whether it was heat or whether it was turbulence or whether it was grind size. If you ground it more, that would have a higher energy value. To try to see if there was a magic equation, a number you could come up with all these different combinations, that you'd end up with the same coffee with different methods. And this is taking it to the extreme, that time would be the energy that is really going to be needed on this.
And water, right? Water is an energy of the
Sure.
source.
Exactly.
But like it's the Turkish and using it with hot water, it's like the opposite extreme, or like a really fine powder flour kind of grind. It's not going to take you a week to do that, right? It'll take you, well, I don't know, but it's I think it goes back to that golden cup standard, right? Like doing these kind of like extremes kind of throws out this like range of like, this is the extractable, 20% that you want. Because if you do this, you're going to get the ultimate amount of soluble yields out of it, unless you cut the time down to that magic number of like, yep, I can measure the brew and it's at 20% total extraction percentage. Let's go ahead and stop it and take the beans out and filter out the coffee, right? That's how you like, how do you judge when cold brew is done?
I don't know. Kaley, did you do any in photography that's called bracketing where you go to extremes? Did you do even thought process extreme um, brewing methods to get to where you ended up with your competition approach?
Not necessarily extreme. I mean, over the course of your coffee career, I feel like we always try something very weird or different,
Sure.
whether it be extremely fine, extremely coarse. For me, with training for competition specifically, I guess it's not necessarily an extreme, but kind of outside the box. I was consistently getting, 1.4, 1.45 TDS. And it's kind of one of those things. It's like, that's too high technically, but it tasted amazing and it tasted so good.
Sure.
And you have this kind of internal debate with yourself where you're like, but this is the extreme. Like, this is beyond the extreme. This is outside of the box. This is incorrect. But also being like, this would do really well in competition because it tastes amazing. So
And
yeah.
I feel like what you did, like with the really larger, like a finer grind with a faster extraction time, did kind of not really. I mean, that's not normal, I would say, right? Unless you guys now see it as being normal. I don't know.
It is now. I feel like 2019 was the year in competition where a few of us did start doing that. The Chinese Brewers Cup champion actually, she also was looking into getting a fast brewer. So she had the origami brewer with a flat bottom. And when I was in China, we compared how quick our brewers were because we were actually trying to do the same thing. We wanted the fastest brew, the finest grind, which was really funny. Um, and so we did a comparison of, whose brewer is faster. Mine was, which is great. But it
And
was, yeah, it was interesting to see that goal for that year because before that wasn't what
can I
people
ask
were
you,
trying to do.
with that being said, did you see that what kind of like coffee to water ratio did you use and because of the faster extraction? I'm thinking clover, right? I'm thinking
Mm-hmm.
that's a minute and a half extraction time. It's a finer grind and they have like little pressure, but they kind of have like a heavier throw weight. So the brew ratio is a little bit. So was that something that you applied to your recipe, or did you kind of how did you approach the ratio decision?
Honestly, it still brews very similarly to a normal flat bottom brewer. I think, like I said, the biggest change was the grind size, but my ratio still was around a 1 to 15 or 1 to 14, like pretty standard. And my brew time was actually pushing around 3 minutes. I think that is also largely coffee dependent. So it really just depends on the coffee. Um, in my experience, ratio is that's what it is. It's age of the coffee, how the coffee is tasting.
Oh my
The
gosh,
brewer to an extent, but not for this particular brewer.
great segue. That's exactly what I want to talk about. So in this the background of these floating beans on water, I just love it because I was like looking at it, I was like, look at that little bubble, isn't that cute? So like there's a green coffee attributes, density, bean size, and moisture. This is a whole slide. I don't know how I'm going to go through this, but you just mentioned that like it like what the coffee is made of really depends on how it's going to be extracted at the end of the day. As far as like also you said freshness, right? But the freshness of the green coffee is another attribute, right? And then you have the roast level, and then roasted coffee freshness. I think you mentioned that. Proportion ratio, we talked about that. We talked about grind size, distribution, time, temperature, water, turbulence, pressure, extraction method, and filter medium. Am I missing anything? That's what I really did. I was like, I just ran out of like slide space, but I'm kind of curious. Is there are these all of the things that you think about before you brew coffee, or how do you tell someone this is a good way to brew coffee and not tell them all this?
That's
Because
a great question. The two main things I focus on are being a barista or a barista trainer. I don't, roast or green buy or anything. So typically my focus is post roast and like how fresh it is and how what the roast level is. So I start there. Usually for darker roasts, it will likely be a different ratio than I would a lighter coffee. Same with different processes. And then how fresh or how old the coffee is. Those are the things I like to talk to people the most about. Like, this coffee is 2 weeks off the roast. You might actually need to use a little more coffee to brew it. And opposite end there, like, this coffee is really fresh. We might need to use a little less coffee.
Um, for some of our audience out there, maybe I think it'd be kind of fun to talk about roast level and extraction and what's the difference between a light roast and a dark roast when you're brewing coffee. Mentioning that you might have to use more or less of one or the other. Marty or either one of you, like whoever wants to explain that'd be great. So like a dark roast, more or less.
Kaley?
And why?
Yeah. So typically, I love talking about this because it's fun. So picture the amount of coffee you have as work for the water to do. So you have X amount of water, this big of a pile of work, and like this big of a pile of work over the same amount of time. The water is able to get through more of the smaller pile over the same amount of time than the larger pile. It's kind of hover in the middle. So when you have a dark roast coffee, all coffee actually extracts in 3 phases. The first phase, you get brightness or acidity. The middle phase is where you start getting sweetness. And the third phase is where you start getting the bitterness. And you need all 3 to achieve a balanced cup. You want equal parts sweetness, acidity, or brightness, as we like to call it, and bitterness. With a dark roast, you already are going to get those heavily sweet notes and bitters. So you're already going to have a good chunk of that last part of it. So by using more coffee for a dark roast, so let's say 27 grams in versus like 24 for like a pour over with 350 grams of water, you're actually giving the water more work to do. And you're going to let that extraction hover just in that sweetness range, because we know the coffee's bitterness is super easy to extract. So we're going to try to keep that extraction in the first 2 phases to limit any additional bitterness. So on the opposite end, light roasts, or say you have a coffee that you know is going to be very fruity, very bright, and very acidic. You're going to get that out of there, but you need to push it to get the sweetness and the bitter in order to balance out the acidity. So sometimes you want to start on a little lower dose and a wider ratio, so that way you can push that extraction more into the sweetness and bitterness phase, to get those notes out of there again to balance out the acidity.
Is there a certain sorry, Marty, you can jump in and ask questions anytime, because I got one more about light roasted coffee having a lot of organic matter.
I was just going to say that's exactly how I would have described it.
Marty, go for it. Okay.
No, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
No, I was thinking, like, as like roasting a lot of coffee and understanding the difference between how much weight is lost through the roasting process with a darker roast versus a lighter roast. I'm thinking there's a lot of there's more organic material that's left in a light roast, and it seems like the darker roast maybe have less organic matter because it's been roasted a little bit darker, so therefore it kind of like ends at a lighter weight but a larger volume, and the light roasted coffees are heavier and more condensed and smaller. So would a lighter roast take more energy, water, or heat to get to the end result? Like if you were doing a light roast and a dark roast, treating them differently, and from that angle, I guess, did you explain that already, or am I coming from a different angle talking about the same thing?
No, that's also a good point as far as like, especially density of the bean. That's essentially what that is. So the constant reintroduction of fresh water is energy. So if you have, again, a smaller amount of coffee, then that introduction of fresh water at the same rate is more energy than if you had a lot more coffee. So when you have a less dense bean, using more coffee allows you to retain those flavors without pushing too much into that extraction.
Well, so in the background, we've got full immersion, and then we've got pour over, which is like pass through. And you're talking about coffee or hot water going over rapidly, consistently going over these particles versus full immersion completely suspended in boiling water for a long period of time. What's the difference? What's the taste difference? What do you, not necessarily what do you prefer, but what's the result of those two different methods, you know?
Well, fresh water has more extractability than concentrated water. So
Ooh,
if
great question, great answer. Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
I like it. I like it. I'm a fan.
Go
I
for
agree.
it. Go with that. That's great.
So if you were, when you're doing an immersion like a French press, your extraction is actually kind of slowed down a bit because that water is becoming concentrated. It's not a constant reintroduction of fresh water, which is, again, it's able to extract really well. Whereas water that already has a little bit of a concentration of coffee it isn't as great at extracting things. So it actually slows it down a bit, which is why if you're using a French press, darker roasts are actually like pretty ideal because, again, that's keeping that extraction out of the super bitter phase and kind of keeping it right in the middle in the sweet spot, literally, where you want to keep it. So yeah, basically it just comes down to like the concentration of the water, which is why you want really high quality, like pure water, especially when you're brewing coffee, because you want that to be optimal for extraction.
That really makes sense to me. This is like new to me. These are like new ideas going off right now. This is really great. I'm excited about this. So water that's already been suspended in full immersion brewing process, it does seem like has done some work and it's lost some of its functionality in a sense because and it's still trying to work. You're like overworking the water power, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying to put this out super simple because I don't know anything about chemistry, but that makes sense. I'm gonna edit most of this out later, just me talking. So this will make really great clips of you.
Oh,
talking.
John, you are exactly right. Water is a it's an absorber. And the more stuff it has absorbed, the slower it absorbs later. So if it's already got coffee stuff in it, it's not going to extract as much
That's how I feel
coffee
about
stuff.
life sometimes, Marty. Like, just absorb so much, just starting to slow down. You're just like, you know what? I don't want any more, like fresh water. I'm good.
I'm too concentrated.
I don't want to be poured over anymore. Just,
That's great.
But, yeah, let me just do some cold brew, steeping in the fridge for a week. So the turbulence though, what's up with turbulence and pressure should those be on the same bullet point? I actually ran out of room. That's why the same bullet point. But I was like, yeah, they're about the same thing. I don't know. What's the difference between pressure and turbulence in you guys, either of you? I don't know.
I think pressure is primarily used with espresso. I think that's really the only time I ever use it. So pressure is obviously forcing the water through the ground. So very high pressure, obviously is a fine grind. So that's really like pushing everything out of there. Whereas turbulence is something agitating and making everything flip around. So
I was thinking of it like pressure as in like gravity is a type of pressure, but that's our natural state of pressure. But if we add like an AeroPress, that's not necessary. That's kind of like this in between gray area of like, is it really espresso? But there is applied pressure, but is it enough pressure to be classified as espresso? But it's not, like you said, I don't think it's turbulence though.
I'll add something to the pressure. You're all thinking positive pressure. What about the clover with negative pressure? Because it does its final extraction by pulling a vacuum. Another machine out there, the Beacon or Beacon, however you pronounce it, again uses a process of vacuum of pressure, so it's negative pressure to create a cellular opening, if you will, of what you've ground in there, whether it's coffee or tea, to help out with the extraction. So I would say pressure doesn't necessarily have to be positive pressure. It could be negative pressure. And we all know that has a huge effect on what flavors you extract out of there.
Have you played with the trifecta?
Yeah, yeah. And that's more of a, it does use bubbles, but because it's not a huge pressure variance, it's more of an agitator, the bubbles that are up in there. So it would be in the turbulence category, a little bit less like, but yeah, I like the trifecta for tea. Makes a great tea.
So, Kaley, like about the filter medium, again, I think a lot of people ask me this too, sort of like metal filter cone versus paper filter cone.
Mhm.
And obviously it kind of depends on what you're doing, but like, is there some, what are the positives and what are the downsides of using a metal cone filter? And is it for everybody? I don't know.
Yeah, the metal cone's great. I think a huge positive for it is that it's reusable. To me, that's the biggest thing. It's very sustainable. It's great. It's great if you want a little bit more body to your coffee, or almost if you like the sediment in your coffee. Typically, you'll get a little bit of that. Um, that also could be a negative to some people. It could make the coffee not as clear or as clean, or allow the flavors to be really like pinpointed. That being said, you can still make really good coffee out of metal filters. It's a different mouthfeel from paper filters, but it is reusable.
So the grind size when you're using a metal filter versus like a paper filter of let's say they're both number 4 size cone filter, do you have to be concerned with how fine you go with the metal filter or how coarse you go? Is there a big swing of change on that?
Typically, I go coarser when I use a metal filter. However, it doesn't really matter as long as you're in the range. Just again, you might get a little bit more sediment with the metal filter, but some people really enjoy that. Often it falls to the bottom of the cup and you have to worry about it too much. But typically, you can grind pretty close to what you normally would.
I guess it depends on your grinder too. Like what's your particle distribution and do you have any pans you can like sift out all the fine? And you can take about a half hour to brew like your cup in the
Oh,
morning.
you're
I'm using
nerding out on us, John.
nerding out. Get some particle distribution, like sharpen up those burrs. That's
Get
all.
those fines out of there. You should compete.
I don't know. Yeah, I tried it once.
Mhm.
Hey, I think fines are of value. I think you need fines. We've played with different consistencies of grind, and just because your particles are exactly the same size doesn't necessarily mean that's going to extract the best cup. Some of the best cups we had to put some fines back in it to get some of those flavors that, now it's like salt and pepper on a steak. You don't want too much of it, but it needs to be there.
Marty, that's a really good point. After competing for a few years, especially in like the compulsory sessions, you see so many people like sifting out those fines. Like, we don't want those fines. And personally, I never have done that in competition. Like, I'd much rather rely on a good grinder and try to get a more narrow particle distribution, because
Mhm.
you do want those fines. Like, I love the fines. I want an closer particle size, but I don't
Sure.
want them to be completely uniform, because you do lack complexity when you do that.
And I
That's
did
that's my
that. I
experience.
did pretty well with it, but I used the clever and I chose a certain particle distribution and 2 different ranges. So it wasn't necessarily all exactly the same, but again, it does really change things. Just like coffee, for example, I tried that with a screen size of roasted coffee, or even green coffee, saying like, well, this is a range between 15 plus 18 plus. I'm just going to use the 17, and with an Ethiopian, and I cupped it side by side, and the coffee that had all this variation was better than the screen sorting. But
It's a really good point.
yeah, so I think it works. But so that kind of leads me to the question session of asking, how do you repeat a brew recipe that you like? Let's say you've kind of come up with something and you want to repeat it or tell people about it. what kind of like, how do you measure it, or how do you write it down and kind of aim for it, or what's your process?
Ooh, I usually write it down. I think the numbers are the easy part. You can say this is your ratio, this is the type of coffee you use, this is the brewer. Um, it gets a little bit tricky when you talk about agitation, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. Um, and saying high agitation in the beginning, middle, medium agitation, and however you do it. But to each person, that could be very different. High agitation of someone could be just stirring it like vigorously, or just pouring really high, or not, or they just think high agitation is just tiny bit of agitation. So I think that's the hardest thing to convey, like what is high agitation.
Okay, that
There's
reminds me of like being in the office and everybody's like, just put a scoop in. And I'm like, well, your scoop is a lot different than my scoop, because like, are you doing like a heaping? And what's heaping mean, right? It's not very accurate. It's like, well, it's a shallow heaping spoon. What's your spoon size? I don't know. So yeah, agitation is really difficult because that's a very hard thing to measure, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not easily measurable. The only thing I can think of is if you have a scale that can you see those scales that measure what you put in the top and what you weigh in the bottom. That would be the best way to measure agitation, but it's not even measuring agitation, it's just measuring how much water over X amount of time you're pushing in there. So if you're pouring really fast or really high, you can recreate that by saying I poured X amount of water over X amount of seconds, and you can say it agitated pretty vigorously. But again, you're like, what is vigorously? Like, what is that?
Hey, Marty, do you think we've gone off the deep end here? Is this
No, no. In fact,
I
we're not the only ones that were met with that. We do a lot of work for one of the major fast food joints that is doing specialty coffee, and some of their training, agitation, not in the brew methods, but it's in incorporating syrups into their drinks. And so they had to quantify how deep the spoon goes into the cup and quantify how many circles they make in the stirring. And so obviously they had that same discussion on agitation and how to replicate that from person to person. So
yeah, and also pressure on a tamper. How many, like they have those all different types of techniques there. But
sure.
Oh, I have another question. Oh my gosh, this is a good one. I don't know. This is probably an easy one, but okay, competition level coffee preparation versus at-home coffee preparation. Is there a difference for you? I mean,
Huge difference. Competition is like another full-time job, and you just spend so many hours writing down recipes, doing TDS, measuring everything, talking about flavor notes all the time. At home, it's a Technivore Mocha Master, and that's what I
okay.
do. But
What's your favorite brew? What's your brew ratio?
I do 90 grams of coffee and then full 10 cups in the reservoir.
And how much of that
So
10 cups do you drink?
a good chunk of it throughout the
Okay.
day.
That's a good that's a good amount of coffee you got.
What's even worse is I honestly, if I don't drink it all, I'll put it in the refrigerator and refrigerate it for the next morning, because I'm a terrible coffee professional. But
Wait, do you microwave it? Is that because like
no, I drink it
okay.
iced usually in the mornings. But
Okay.
it's at home. I like to keep it very simple because my job is coffee. I spent years doing competition, and occasionally I'll brew out of the bloom or my brewer every now and then. But overall, I like to keep it really simple because my day to day is keeping it not simple. So.
Right.
You know,
so,
I'm going to make a bumper sticker or a T-shirt or something that says, "Good coffee sweetens up as it gets cool."
It's good.
yeah, or
It's really good.
I'll send you my mason jar, and by the time
Okay.
it gets to you, it should be done brewing. Never mind.
I'd love to try it.
Yeah, you should try. So
Maybe in like 2
words-
weeks.
Yeah, I don't know, like probably break in the mail and make a big mess. It's in glass. Terrible. So parting words, anything that you want to say before you leave?
Could I pop in for a question for a second? I feel like this is something that, at least in the brew, like when I was working with other baristas as a barista at the time that came up. A big discussion is just what flavor differences you get out of your pour style and like what you would suggest doing at home. I know that some people say consistent pour or like a constant pour. Some are like stop and go. And then some are, you pour, you wait, it's usually like a pour and then a second pour and you're done, At least I've seen those all done at coffee shops. What would you say has been your findings, at least with tasting, different pouring styles and so on and so forth? What would be your comments on that?
That's an awesome question. I love this. So it still goes back to the 3 phases of brewing. So again, the first phase, you're going to get a lot of brightness, a lot of fruit flavors, middle phase, sweetness, body, and in the end, bitterness. So if I'm really trying to highlight, let's say, sweetness, I'll usually start with that being the highest point of agitation. Say I split it up into 3 pours after the bloom, then I might really increase my agitation or lengthen my pour in the middle to have that constant reintroduction of fresh water, or use the agitation to really bring that out during that phase, and then maybe taper off in the end. A lot of times, especially, well, I say most coffees, if I'm really trying to make the acidity pop, most specialty coffee, I will increase agitation or keep agitation really high in the beginning and then really high during a second pour and make it more medium in the third pour, and then maybe none in the fourth pour just to reach a ratio. So it just depends on what you're trying to highlight. If you're using something like a dark roast, something I've really enjoyed doing, if say I have a V60 and that's all I have to brew out of, and I have this super, super dark roast, again, that constant reintroduction of fresh water is going to just really extract that coffee, and it's going to push it to the point of almost being too bitter. So I like to use a little bit more coffee, but I like to almost mimic an immersion brewer in my V60. So I might do a bloom and then fill it all the way up to the top and let it fall down and fill it all the way up to the top again, until I reach my ratio, because you do kind of mimic an immersion there. You fill it up and let it do its thing brewing, and that usually keeps that extraction range more in like the sweetness range. Whereas if I had a light roast, I'd want to do more pulse pours.
Interesting.
Well, I have another.
Yeah, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
So like on the topic of pouring, let's talk about it. I love this. So like I always like the difference between a shower head and one stream of straight pour of water out of the kettles, right? If you put like a little shower head at the end of a kettle, I mean, the distribution of like raindrops versus like a steady stream, how do you feel about those two different water deliveries, and what impact would that make? Would it make compaction or not? I guess it depends.
Do we need a gooseneck watering can?
Well,
Mod Bar makes a tip for their pour over station that is a dispersion.
Well, so then what's the
that
difference?
mimics that.
Why do that and versus not doing that? Spray head versus no spray head.
Well, I think typically the water pressure on the spray head will be lower. It's kind of like that like the mellow drip that you have. You've seen that tool where you pour the water and it just lets it drip onto it. That's actually a way of decreasing agitation while still being really controlled. So I think a lot of it will be the spray head can help evenly distribute water, but a lot of times, since the water pressure is a little bit lower and more distributed in a wider plate, then that agitation can be decreased at vital moments in the brew.
And then so you won't get the benefits of agitation as much otherwise.
Or you can have the benefits of less agitation. So if I were to use, say, a mellow drip, and I really, really want to control my agitation or have it be close to nothing, then, let's say I have a coffee that really, really needs to not have agitation in the end of the brew, then switching out for something like a mellow drip and pouring that in there and just letting it drip on all sides can basically bring agitation next to none, which could be really helpful.
Oh my gosh, I have a great question for the both of you too. How much coffee is too much coffee to brew at one time as a pour over? Can you do, let's say, a pound of coffee and brew it, grind a pound of coffee and just take a bunch of hot water and brew like, how many gallons would a pound make, Marty? Anybody, Kaley?
Well, I know we did 6 gallons with a pound with the roastery.
Right. So, but not manual, right? That was with an automated machine, right?
It's automated machine.
Well, you could do it manually, right? You just
Here's my answer is
that's when you're actually whipping out the watering can.
Your contact time still has to be within reason. Right. So I think that's your controlling factor, is how quickly can you get that quantity of water through those grounds. I think that's the deciding factor. That's my answer.
And one more question as well with this. I know we briefly touched on it, was temperature, with good coffees. Like oftentimes as it cools down, you're going to really notice some new flavors and sweetness develop. When you're in competition, what are you shooting for with serving temperature, and how did you obtain that goal?
Yeah, so one quick thing on that, the reason coffee tastes sweeter as it cools is that any liquid that's closer to your own body temperature will taste sweeter, which is why you steam, milk to a certain temperature. When you have a small coffee drink, you want it to be typically a little cooler so it's closer to your body temperature, so you can perceive sweetness that balances out with the bitterness of, say, the espresso in a macchiato. You don't want to go too cool because gross, and you don't want like cool latte that's like kind of warm, kind of cool. But so that's why it tastes sweeter as it cools. For everyday brewing, what I found is that my grind size actually affected it a lot. With my brewer in competition, because I had to grind so fine, I actually had to start my water temperature at around 190 degrees Fahrenheit. And for years we've been told 195 to 205. That's the range at which you brew coffee, but now we're starting to see that's not always true, because we have new devices coming out where we can get a little outside the box with grind size and different variables. So I think grind has a lot to do with it. And then, density of the bean, like light roast, typically you want to start with a little bit of a higher temperature. With dark roast, I almost always start right at that maybe lower middle range, like 198, 199. I'm a big fan of lower water temperature. I love it because I'm a big fan of agitation. So I try not to rely too much on water temperature to extract my coffee, and more of how I interact with the coffee.
Okay, and then very last one for me. I had a few questions, but we're still on temperature. We're still on temperature. You make a great pour over, and you're like, I love it, but it's summertime. You want it iced. What's your typical kind of transition from, I made a great pour over with this, I want to do a nice ice pour over? Because I've had some coffees on, ice pour overs are starting to pop up more and more. You'll see it more and more places. What's your at home recipe of transitioning a good hot pour over to an ice pour over?
Yeah, that's a good question. I usually like to make it a touch more concentrated. So I'll start with maybe like a larger amount of coffee, but also a lot less water, maybe just over half of what I would normally use, and then dilute it with ice. There are so many different recipes you could use, but I think for me, it's, say I'm used to normally doing 22 to 23 grams, I might go to 27, and instead of 350 grams of water, maybe like 200 to 220 with similar pours, and then fill up a decanter full of ice and let it dilute and cool down.
Yeah, I've done a similar method to that, where I had it like a Chemex and I weighed the amount of ice, and I thought, well, okay, we got to discount that amount of ice weight water from the brew water that you would be using, and then pouring that less water over the same amount of coffee that you would be using for the whole thing, but it would just be less water going through the coffee bed. But the ice was inside of the Chemex, so it was kind of slowly, kind of shocking. The temperature, making it cold right away. I don't know if it tasted good to me. I'm not sure if that's like not a good thing to do or not, but
I think the shocking thing has been debunked over the years.
Good.
It has, yeah.
So what do they call it now? Non-shocked or just kind of chilled?
Nothing is shocking anymore.
Nothing is shocking.
Nothing is
right?
shocking.
Right. Wow.
Hey, John, we've gone well over an hour, and
Yeah.
I cannot believe for 1 minute that we haven't brought up bypass.
Well, yeah, because how could I not do bypass? I always bring that up. I brought that up every damn episode. I'm like, what do you think about bypass?
The proverbial bypass.
Well, there you go.
Definitely
you
has
asked the
something to
question.
play with the
We've talked a lot on it. Kaylee, thoughts?
What do you think about bypass? Yeah.
Bypass is really fun.
What
It is actually a really good way of reaching a TDS that you want, while still you can get a lot of flavor and make your coffee a little bit more concentrated, dilute it with a little bit of water, and you can open up a lot of flavors and reach a good TDS, which is nice. It can really balance out coffee for you. I actually, for competition, accidentally did bypass in my recipe because during my one practice time, I forgot to dump my rinse water out of my decanters after my filter rinse, and I brewed all my coffees over it and realized midway through, like, oh my gosh, I just left the rinse water in my decanters. This is going to be awful. Like, I hate it. And I had been brewing at a pretty high TDS already, and it was tasting great, but we tried them anyway, and it was so good. Like, so much better.
That.
Yeah, and it was because I messed up and forgot to dump my rinse water. So that's when I decided to bypass for my nationals recipe. And what it did was I was able to get all those complex flavors out, but you can kind of add water as you go to where you get the flavor you want. And with a lot of coffees, it could be really different, and it can actually open it up a lot more than you'd expect.
Awesome.
I love the bypass. I think bypasses are great. It's just kind of a, working on machines, like the larger brewers, they always have this bypass. And it's interesting that a lot of people who are using these brewers don't pay a lot of attention, like, 5%, or we don't use it at all. Is there a class that you would teach, Marty, online? Are you gonna do like one of those sessions of like how to best use your bypass, and then maybe Kaley, you could like hone in and like you guys could do it together and like teach the industry how to use bypass and make
that as far as our classes, that is part of our curriculum. It is in the notes on that, and it's our approach is more of a methodical. Let's make this brewer that will do 3 different sizes taste the same at all 3 different sizes, and we'll use varying bypass to achieve that. And what we're shooting for is similar contact times and things like that. But as far as just enhancing, just bettering the cup, we might need to add that to our part of our classes.
Oh, one last thing. I think our guest might want to go, so we should probably wrap this up.
She's been a sweetheart,
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Kaley, for joining us today for Coffee Tech Talk Tuesday. And we'll be back next week with another exciting guest. It'll be our 20th episode, the last one of this year. We're still raising money and funds for GoFundMe, and every new subscriber donates another $1, but I think we're just gonna put all that money down and donate.
We'll float it ahead.
Yeah,
pay it forward.
And so next week, I think we're gonna clean some things up and leave this year nice and clean. So that's the hint. We're going to talk about cleaning next week. Did I hint that enough? Okay.
Hey, right. Cleaning is important.
Yeah. All right. So my name is John Ferguson. You can get in touch with me here, everybody. And Marty, we'll go to you, and then Kaley.
Marty Rowe, Kansas City, workbenchcoffeelabs.com. Looking for 2021 year of the education. So look for us for that.
Kaley, how can we get in touch with you if anybody has any questions, or if they want to know more about something?
Yeah, you can go ahead and follow me on Instagram at Kaley P. Gann, KaleyPGann. Honestly, that's how I communicate with most coffee people nowadays. So
excellent. Well, thanks again for being on the show, and
thanks for having me.
Yeah,
it's been awesome.
It's great to see you guys.
It's our longest show we've ever had. It's like 2 episodes and plenty of great stuff to edit out and to keep. So You'll be seeing some really great clips coming up, everybody. So have a good night. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.